It is 4:10 in the morning on an Amish farm, and while most of the world is still buried underneath blankets, Ruth is already standing in the darkness, striking a match. In less than 2 hours, 15 people will be expecting breakfast. And here is what makes that breakfast almost unbelievable. Not one thing on that table will come from a supermarket. There will be no delivery van pulling into the yard, no quick trip to the grocery store, no frozen breakfast waiting in a microwave, no box opened from a cupboard because somebody was too tired to cook. Everything those 15 people are about to eat has to come from somewhere. The eggs have to be gathered, the potatoes have to be prepared, the bread has to be baked, the fire has to be built, the milk has to come from somewhere, the vegetables have to be grown, and the food that will carry this family through winter has to be preserved months before winter ever arrives. And Ruth knows something that modern life has allowed many of us to forget. Food does not simply appear. Somebody has to make sure it is there. So how does an Amish household of 15 people actually feed itself 3 times a day without depending on the conveniences most of us would consider essential? And more importantly, what happens between that first match struck before dawn and the final dish washed at night? Because the surprising part is not simply how much food they eat. The surprising part is how much work has to happen long before anyone ever takes the first bite. Stay with me until the end, because by the time we reach the evening meal, you may look at an ordinary plate of food very differently. Ruth's day begins in almost complete darkness. There is no bright kitchen light announcing that the day has begun, no electric cooker waiting patiently for her to turn a dial. There is simply the quiet of the house, the cold of the early morning, and the wood stove. She strikes the match. The flame catches. A few pieces of split wood go into the stove, and slowly, almost reluctantly, the fire begins to wake. That fire is going to become the heart of the kitchen for the next several hours. Before Ruth can cook anything, she has to create the heat that will cook it. Think about that for a moment. In a modern kitchen, we turn a knob and the stove responds immediately. Here, breakfast begins with wood, flame, patience, and work. And while the fire is coming alive, Ruth is already thinking several steps ahead. Breakfast for 15 does not begin at the frying pan. It begins in the chicken coop. She steps outside with a basket while the morning air is still cold enough to make her breath visible. The hens have been awake before her, and now she checks beneath them, gathering the eggs that will become part of breakfast. 2 eggs might be enough for one person. For 15 people, the calculation is very different. A few dozen eggs can disappear surprisingly quickly when you are feeding a large household. So she gathers what the hens have given and carries it back toward the kitchen. The fire is stronger now. The cast iron stove is warming, and breakfast begins. The eggs are scrambled in batches because one skillet is not going to feed 15 hungry people at once. There is cornmeal mush, the thick and simple porridge that has been part of Amish food traditions for generations. There are potatoes, perhaps leftovers from the previous evening, transformed into something warm and filling. There may be a jar of peaches or applesauce waiting on the shelf, preserved months earlier when the fruit was plentiful. And then there is the bread. That bread did not appear because someone remembered to buy it yesterday. It was baked in the same wood stove. And there is an important reason she makes more than the family needs for just one meal. You do not light a wood stove, heat it, and do all that work for one small loaf if you know you will need bread again tomorrow. So the work is done in quantities that make sense for the household. The coffee is prepared. Milk is brought to the table. And depending on the family and the season, that milk may come from a cow belonging to the farm rather than from a carton brought home from a store. By 6 in the morning, the house that was silent less than 2 hours earlier has completely changed. 15 people are gathering around the table. Children who are old enough to work have already begun their day. The food is passed from one person to another. Heads bow, there is prayer. And then the quiet morning becomes the familiar sound of forks, plates, chairs, and people eating. But here is where the story becomes much bigger than breakfast. Because breakfast for 15 people is difficult. Feeding 15 people every day is something else entirely. The moment the breakfast plates begin to disappear, Ruth is already thinking about the next meal. And the next one after that, and the next season, because 15 mouths do not simply require more food. They require an entirely different way of thinking about food. Think about what happens inside a modern household of 4. You go to the store, you buy groceries, something runs out, and you buy more. You forget something, and perhaps you make another trip tomorrow. If the pantry is empty, there is a store. If dinner does not work out, there is another option. If you do not feel like cooking, there are prepared meals. For Ruth's family, many of those options simply do not exist. The food has to be planned before it is needed. That changes everything. When Ruth bakes bread, she does not think in terms of one loaf. She thinks in terms of several loaves because the stove is already hot and the family will need bread throughout the coming days. When vegetables are abundant during summer, she does not look at a garden basket and simply think, this will make dinner tonight. She has to think much farther ahead. What will the family eat when the garden is buried under snow? What will happen when fresh vegetables are no longer available? How many jars will be needed? How much meat? How much fruit? How much grain? How much bread? How much of everything? This is where the Amish kitchen stops looking like a charming picture of old-fashioned living and starts revealing what it really requires. Work, planning, discipline, and an extraordinary amount of repetition. Imagine growing beans for 15 people. Now imagine preserving enough beans that 15 people can still eat them months later. That is not a handful of jars. That may mean hundreds. If Ruth cans green beans in the summer, she is not simply preserving a little extra because it feels satisfying to see jars lined up on a shelf. Those jars are part of the family's future food supply. Every jar represents a small promise. A promise that when winter arrives, there will still be something to open. And that is one of the great differences between this life and the modern food system. For most people, the supply chain is invisible. A truck arrives, a warehouse has already done its work, a farmer somewhere has already harvested the crop, a factory has already processed it, a store has already stocked the shelf, and we simply walk into the building and choose what we want. Ruth cannot depend on that invisible chain in the same way. Her supply chain is visible. It is the garden, the animals, the cellar, the shelves, the stove, the hands of her family, and every one of those things can fail. That is why preserving food is not merely a hobby, it is preparation. By mid-morning, the older children may be heading toward the one-room schoolhouse with lunches packed from food prepared at home. Homemade bread, meat, a piece of pie, whatever the family has available and has prepared. And while some of the children are away at school, Ruth's attention turns back toward the garden. Because the garden is not decoration. It is part of the kitchen. Rows of beans, corn, tomatoes, cabbage, potatoes. Whatever the family grows, it has a purpose. The garden has to produce food for today while also producing food for tomorrow. And that means harvest time is not something that happens only when it is convenient. When something is ready, somebody has to gather it. The vegetable that is ready this morning may be on the family's table at noon, or it may go directly into a preserving pot because the family knows it will not remain fresh forever. And this is another thing that becomes obvious when you look closely at a large Amish household. 15 people do not depend on one woman doing 15 people's worth of work alone. The household works because the work is shared. Even the children learn early that being part of a family means being part of the work that keeps the family going. A young child may sit on the porch shelling peas, another may carry water, another may help with the chickens, an older child may knead dough, someone else may keep an eye on a pot while another person is outside working. The lesson is simple. You do not have to be grown before you can contribute something valuable. And by the time a child reaches the age of 10 or 11, helping is no longer simply about keeping a parent company. That child may actually know how to perform useful work in the kitchen or around the farm. Kneading dough, preparing food, helping with animals, working in the garden, learning the rhythm of the household. So when people look at a family of 15 and wonder how one household can possibly keep everyone fed, they sometimes miss the most important part of the answer. It is not 15 mouths against one pair of hands. It is 15 people participating in a system of work. That is what makes it possible. By late morning, there is a particular smell over the farm. You might notice the wood smoke first, then the smell of turned earth from the garden, and if it is preserving season, there may be that unmistakable sweetness and sharpness of tomatoes cooking down in a large pot. The kitchen is never completely silent. It is never completely finished. There is always something waiting. Something to peel, something to wash, something to stir, something to preserve, something to feed, something to prepare for tomorrow. Then comes lunch, or in many Amish households, dinner, because the largest meal of the day may be served around midday. And unlike breakfast, this meal may not bring all 15 people together at once. Some children are still at school. A man may still be working outside. Someone may be finishing a job in the field. So lunch can be more practical, more flexible, more about eating what is available and getting back to work. There may be leftover meat sliced onto homemade bread, a pot of soup, cheese, milk, vegetables from the garden, whatever has already been prepared. But even when the meal looks simple, there is something important to remember. Simple does not mean effortless. There is no microwave waiting to rescue the meal. There is no instant meal hiding in the freezer. There is no restaurant around the corner ready to solve the problem. The food still had to be prepared. And now we arrive at the part of the year that truly reveals whether the family's planning was good enough. Winter. Summer is not merely about enjoying fresh tomatoes and green beans. Summer is when the family is racing against time, because the harvest does not wait. When the tomatoes ripen, they must be picked. When the beans are ready, they must be harvested. When fruit is available, it must be processed. The family has a short window in which to turn abundance into something that can survive the months ahead. And that is why there are days when Ruth can spend 8 or 10 hours working in a kitchen that is already hot from the stove. Not making one dinner, not making one dessert, preserving the future. Imagine standing beside a boiling canning pot for hours. Jar after jar is sterilized, filled, sealed, processed, removed, set aside to cool, and then the next jar. Again, and again, and again.